Good afternoon, everybody, and welcome to the second in the series dedicated to Arthur, the once and future king. As I said the last time, Nancy Dickson needs no introduction for a variety of reasons, but I thought for those of you who are participating in one of her courses for the first time, I'd tell you just a little bit more about her. And that is growing up in a family that loved to tell stories, some of them even true, moving constantly as a child and adult, developing a love of languages, growing an awareness of the power of words to create and destroy, all led her to a PhD in Celtic mythology. She loves to tell stories to anyone willing to listen. In no particular order, and this is an incredible list, she has been a union organizer, a teacher, grades 4 through 6, college professor, continuing education and ESL, translator, writer, editor, proofreader, art and fashion model, La Leche League leader, office organizer, secretary, political activist, wife, and mother. So how's that for a resume? Right. Today, Nancy will continue the saga of the creation of the Arthur myth, the warrior king. My question was, Arthur a real person? And I think at some point, Nancy will get us to think about that issue. So, Nancy, it's yours. I guess you need this back. Huh?
So is this good volume? More volume? A little bit more volume. So today you're going to see me in yet another role, that of hopefully fast on her feet juggler. My computer is in the throes of dying. And for those of you who have laptops or standalone computers, you'll understand, I hope, my frustration. This machine that I'm leaning on right now carefully went through about an hour and a half ago, just before I printed my talk, and took out all the changes I had made this morning. So I will try to weave it back together again, but if this talk is a little unjointed, you'll know why. So when we left Arthur last week, Britain was under attack from the north and from the south. Perils of Pauline, right? Well, we're just going to leave them there. In the middle of this dilemma, I'll give you a spoiler alert. The Southerners won this battle, bringing Norman French culture, language, and myth to Britain. This was the last invasion of these islands, although they were under attack from the Spanish Armada and more recently from the Germans. They were never again conquered. But we need to go back before we can get to William and the explosion of Arthurian stories. I'd like to back up to, yes, I would. I'd like this to work. Oh, please, technology, don't do me in again. Try again. Okay, I would like to back up to two of the three questions I asked right at the beginning of the first class. Who was Arthur, and when was Arthur? We need to combine these two questions, because if we look at the Arthur we think we know, and then we look at the Arthur who existed from the first centuries of his history, we find two very different animals. Bling, bling, bling. Okay. Do it again. Okay. Who was Arthur and when was Arthur? Now, the key components of the Arthurian legend, I think all of us are familiar with. The Round Table, the knights, Gawain, Kay, Bedivere, Lancelot, Galahad, etc. Arthur pulls the stone from the sword, blame it on the computer, the sword from the stone. Queen Guinevere has an affair with Sir Lancelot. He's advised by the wizard Merlin. He's killed by Sir Mordred, who is both his nephew and his son, and his knights sought the Holy Grail. Everybody agree these are the major components of the Arthurian legend? Well, in the centuries before William conquered Britain, these were the components of the legend. Knights is in italics because there weren't any knights then. The only ones who are mentioned, and we saw them in the story of Cullach and Olwen, Gawain, Kay, and Bedivere. Queen Guinevere was not a queen because Arthur was not a king. He was a war chief, a war leader. And Mordred, they fought together and died at the same battle, but there's no relationship mentioned. We don't know whether they were fighting each other, whether they were fighting on the same side. We know nothing except Mordred, Arthur existed together at the same battle. So not a lot. The few accounts we have before William are slim. We had Gildas, the conquest of Britain, written in Latin. Aneurin wrote the Welsh poem Y Gododdin, which mentions Arthur as the quintessential warrior, comparing him to another warrior who was great, but he was no Arthur. Bede, a clergyman, wrote the ecclesiastical history of the English people in Latin, and in 800, roughly, Nennius wrote a history of Britain in Welsh. So before William conquered Britain, the stories of Arthur were kept alive in the main by Welsh clerics. The Historia Brittonum, Arthur is named as a war leader who led 12 battles against the Saxons. The 12 battles listed, however, take place over 100+ years and are very far apart. So one man could not possibly have fought in all of them. They are not history, even though they appear in a book called History. The 12 battles are, in fact, the first signs of a legend. Nennius described Arthur going into battle with the image of Christ's mother on his shoulder. Nennius, a Welsh churchman, made sure that the hero Arthur was fully Christian during an era when the Saxons, who were mostly non-Christian, were invading Britain. Arthur fought against the invading Saxons, and he was turned into a mythic but Christian legend, a strong man like the Welsh hero Bendigeidfran, whose head was able to protect his people from invasions, first for 87 years while he was traveling with his troop of warriors, and then after it was buried by its guardians where the Tower of London now stands. They buried the head facing France so as to ward off invasions. But this seems very curious because at the time, France was not one of the threats to Britain. But Arthur was said to have dug up the head so that Britain might be defended by the valor of his warriors rather than by a talisman. And here we see the first intrusion of pride, one of the faults impugned to Arthur by the authors of the saints' lives. He was used as a contrast. The saints did all these wonderful things, and Arthur was a strong man, but he was proud, he was arrogant, he had none of the saintly virtues. He also, by digging up the head, removed the protection from the south, from invasion of the south, which was the only force to conquer Britain after that. So basically, in this story, Britain is brought down by King Arthur. Seems ironic. So where did the rest of the story come from? All of the things that were listed on that long list of key components of Arthurian legend that I showed a few minutes ago. We have no more manuscript tradition of Arthur. Excuse me. This is just not my day. We have no more manuscript tradition of Arthur between the earliest mentions in the 5th century and the explosion of stories about him following the Norman conquest. There are only 4 or 5 references to Arthur in the manuscripts over this 400-year period. That's not a lot of information. The manuscripts that the Anglo-Saxons and the Vikings didn't burn got stored in damp places. And we, living in Florida, know what happens when you store paper in a damp place. Unless we are extremely lucky in finding a hidden cache of manuscripts, it's highly unlikely that any other written record of Arthur will appear. So what we are left with is 2 of the 3 other sources that historians use. One is oral history, which is cited in several of the manuscripts from much later, and the other is the archaeological record. With Arthur, there are few archaeological sources. Oh, that was a long time ago. But the ones we have are very suggestive of a real warlord, not yet a king, who existed just about the time the Saxons were invading and the same time that the few existing records put Arthur as being important. In the existing manuscripts, 3 locations are associated with Arthur. Tintagel, the place of his birth, Glastonbury, the place of his death, and Cadbury Hill, all located in the southwest part of Britain, what is now Cornwall. This is the first one. This is Tintagel. which shows archaeological evidence, not specifically of Arthur, but of occupation here by a high status group who traded, not overland where the invading Angles and Saxons were fighting the British, but by ship. And this rocky peninsula is almost completely surrounded by water. They traded with people in the Mediterranean, in France, and other far-flung countries. A strong warlord rose up here who pushed the Angles back. It was an easily defensible site. There's just a very narrow causeway that goes across. They've built bridges now, which takes all the fun out of getting there. But the existing path would only allow passage by 3 people abreast, so that, you know, if you're an army, you don't move forward 3 by 3. When you get up the hill to the main site, this is a reconstruction, and it's not as easy to see as I might like. These are some houses which would also have worked as defenses from people trying to come across the causeway. There are buildings up on the top of the hill. And not only was this place easy to defend, unlikely as it may seem, it had a supply of fresh water at all times. So unlike other defensive sites, they didn't have to rely on rainwater. They could have fresh water out of their wells. Now, these buildings were not made of stone. Forget about that vision of Arthur. Once the Romans left, they were wattle and daub or wood. And the harbor down here, maybe you can see, they put in little ships to show where the harbor is. And the little ships give you an idea of the scale of this place. It's massive. The view from the top gave the inhabitants a view over the whole southern part of the Bristol Channel. So they could see enemies coming by sea. They could see them coming by land. It was a stronghold that could withstand a long siege. Whichever great warrior lived there, it was a civilized stronghold. It's easy to assume that the fall of Rome threw all of Britain into obscurity. But here on this dramatic Cornish cliff top, they built substantial stone buildings. The ones down along the edge were the ones for the peons, but the ones at the top were made of stone. They used, and again, this is thanks to the archaeologists, fine tablewares from Turkey, drank from decorated Spanish glassware, used and feasted on pork, fish, and oysters. Artifacts date this stronghold to the 6th century, and a stone was uncovered which gives a name very like Arthur in letters from the 6th century. Nearby is Cadbury Hill. It was a Bronze Age hill fort in Somerset. It has been associated with King Arthur's legendary court at Camelot and has been in use from 470 until sometime after 580. There was a great hall, 66 feet by 33 feet, and showed that the innermost Iron Age defenses had been refortified, providing a defended site double the size of any other known fort of the period. All of the other hill forts that had been in use earlier had just been let fall into ruin. Shards of pottery from the Eastern Mediterranean were also found, indicating wide trade links. It therefore seems probable that it was the chief fort of a major Brythonic ruler, with his family, his war bands, his servants, and his horses. Local tradition, first written down in about 542, holds that Cadbury Castle was King Arthur's Camelot. The site and the Great Hall are extensive, and the Arthurian scholar Geoffrey Ashe argued that it was the base for the Arthur of history. Now, they could have used this fort to defend themselves against attacks from the east. This is where the Saxons and the Angles and the Jutes were. If, indeed, Arthur was conceived at Tintagel, he may have been a prince of Damonia and used Cadbury as a stronghold on his eastern frontier. A recent archaeological dig showed that it was exactly the right time for Arthur to have been living here, and where he might have been living, defending this area from the Angles and the Saxons. Now, this is right next to Glastonbury Abbey, which, according to tradition, is the place where Arthur died. The medieval historian Gerald of Wales tells us that sometime before he died in 1189, Henry II gave a message to the monks at Glastonbury Abbey regarding the location of the grave of King Arthur and his queen, Guinevere. Gerald also tells us that Henry had gotten the information from an unnamed Welsh bard, those unnamed sources. Gerald's account goes on to say that the Glastonbury monks, presumably acting on this information, had uncovered a hollowed-out log which had been split in two and had two bodies in it. They were digging between two stone pyramids standing together in the Abbey cemetery. The log coffin had been buried quite deep, around 16 feet down. A stone slab cover had been found at the 7-foot level, and attached to its underside was an oddly shaped cross with a Latin inscription on it, naming the occupants of the coffin as King Arthur and his queen, Guinevere. I don't know whether your Latin is up to trying to translate this, but mine certainly isn't. Now, you might wonder about why the bards from Brittany would have had this information about where Arthur and Guinevere were buried. Well, if you remember back to the first class, when Britain was first under attack after the Romans left, and the Angles and the Saxons and the Jutes and the Picts and the Scots and everybody else jumped on the island, a number of people, primarily from the south of the British Isles, left and went to the north of France, an area called Brittany, which is the northwest corner of France, way, way up in the northwest corner. Beautiful area, very wild and full of Celtic stories. Now, these people lived there virtually unmolested during the entire time that the British Isles were under attack, so that the stories that they had taken with them and were telling and retelling were much more likely to stay alive than the same stories which had stayed with the bards in Britain, who were in danger of being killed by the Angles, the Saxons, the Jutes, the Vikings, all those people. You know, life expectancy in Britain was short because there was just virtually constant warfare. So these bones were dug up in 1192 at Glastonbury Tor. Which is nearby the Tor is Glastonbury Abbey. They were dug up at the Abbey. It's here, it's now in ruins, but in 1192, the monks excavated and they found the bones of Arthur and Guinevere and announced this to everybody. Hey guys, really exciting. We've found the bones of famous person, you name it. We never knew where they were buried before, but they were buried here. Now, a lot of people discounted this because the Abbey had recently had a fire and they needed funds to rebuild. And one way to get funds to rebuild is by having a tourist attraction. You know, things haven't changed that much in 1,000 years. But wasn't it? I mean, it was so convenient that they needed money, and somebody had told Henry where the bones were and where to dig and da 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 da. But in recent years, in the 1980s, people decided, archaeologists decided to check it out. Was this true? Was it not true? Because the monks had been very careful to mark the spot where these remains had been dug up. They dug down and they discovered that, in fact, there had been an earlier excavation. They could see evidence of it, evidence that the monks had found somebody. It's just not clear who they found, but they did find bodies. For a long time, the bodies, the bones, were kept on one of the altars in one of the chapels at Glastonbury. But like so many things over time, they disappeared. No one knows where they are. So this leads me to the thing that was supposedly found on top of the burial, the Glastonbury cross, which somebody has translated to say, here lies the renowned King Arthur in the Isle of Avalon. Now, we've got the Isle of Avalon as part of the myth, but Glastonbury is right in the middle of dry land. How could it be an island? Well, if you think back to the earlier slide, the tor that we saw was this high mound reaching up. Some people have suggested that this land may once have been much wetter than it is now, and that the area where Glastonbury Abbey is could have actually been an island. The reason, okay, so the cross has also disappeared. You know, things have a way of disappearing. I don't know about you, but I've got a black hole in my apartment where things disappear for months, only to emerge later. Maybe the Glastonbury cross will emerge later, but people came to see it. It was around, and then it disappeared. Now, how do we know what it looked like if it disappeared? Well, so many people came to see it, and they were fascinated. And this was in the days before cameras, before cell phones, before any of those things. So people drew pictures of what they had seen to take home and show to their friends. We went to Glastonbury Abbey, and we didn't see Arthur's bones, but we saw this wonderful cross that had been buried with them. I love this bit because it shows how the various ways of knowing about Arthur can interrelate. The medieval historian, Gerald of Wales, a writer, tells us that sometime before he died, Henry II gave a message to the monks of Glastonbury Abbey regarding the location of the grave. And he tells us that Henry had gotten that information from an unknown Welsh bard. And Gerald goes on to say that the Glastonbury monks, acting on this information, had in fact done their own excavation, uncovered a hollowed out log containing two bodies. When I hear the words hollowed out log, I think of something with like a donut. The log had been split in half, and the two halves were scooped out and side by side. Another interesting tidbit that doesn't connect to anything in particular, but it's another source of historical evidence in the search for Arthur. In the middle of the 6th century, when Arthur was supposed to have been fighting off the enemies, 4 of the royal houses of Britain all produced sons, firstborn sons, and they're all named Arthur. Now, this was not a common name before this period, and it fell into disuse after this period until much later when one of the ill-fated kings of England was named Arthur. He didn't live long. But this suggests that in the 6th century, it was a good name for a boy who's going to be king. Now, we've been looking at the archaeological record, which many people do not consider real history. So I'd like to raise the issue of what history is. Most of the stories of Arthur before the invention of the printing press are found in histories of Britain written by a variety of learned men. Now, modern scholars are often quick to discount these histories because they can't find the records on which the histories are based. So they say, oh, it's just legends. We don't have a birth date for Arthur. Well, no, you don't, because records like this disappear. They aren't kept. If you start looking at the difference between history and myth, it's very hard to make a definition. Indeed, even the Britannica Encyclopedia introduces their article on history and myth with the following: myth and history represent alternative ways of looking at the past. Defining history is not any easier than defining myth. Of course, we get into the same sort of semantics between history and story, which both come from the same word, same derivation, but somehow in our modern day thinking, history is real, while story is just made up. When people ask questions like, who was Arthur? When did he live? They're asking for what could be called a history of Arthur. But in this class, we're looking beyond dates and locations. We're looking at the man, his companions, and his deeds. The common phrase, history is written by the winners, is true. But beyond that, history is written at a particular time, in a particular place, by a particular person, with probably a particular axe to grind. Scholars and academics have recently exposed the way women, minorities, and indigenous populations have regularly been written out of our history books. Thus, history is not an unbiased record of the past, but a creation of that past that serves to create attitudes in the present. Women scientists, for example, were routinely left out of histories or their discoveries attributed to male colleagues, leaving people with the impression that women were not or could not be scientists. Heroes in the history book are by and large men. The histories written by Bede and Nennius were written in the 8th century by clerics whose country had been overtaken by the Anglo-Saxon barbarians and was at the time being harried by the Norse. They were writing a history of their country that had been invaded and was still under siege. They needed a strong savior figure who might come and take them back to the glorious days of yore. The archaeological record has also been shaped by our view of the history of humans. For years, any grave with weapons in it was clearly a man's grave. But recently, forensic anthropologists are finding these bones are not men at all, but women. In the case of Arthur, the archaeological record has proved very useful. But if you think about, now you may be wondering what all this has to do with King Arthur from 1600 years ago. Arthur and the histories of the kings of Britain were created by scholars and clerics to give Britain the history they could be proud of. An island that had been invaded and conquered so many times needed to be able to look back to a glorious past when they weren't under somebody else's boot heel. The fact that his story, Arthur's, was embellished, polished, and shaped to fit the needs of the people for whom it was written. Again, history is not written for the people who lived back then. It's written for the people who are living in whatever era the author is writing. The third point I'd like to raise here is the question of real. What does real mean? That we can find a grave marker for that person? Does that make that person real? If so, Queen Boudica and Genghis Khan weren't real. We have no idea where they were buried. Is Jeffrey Dahmer more real than Hannibal Lecter? Certainly Lecter is familiar to more people than Dahmer. History can be changed more easily than story because of the way it's carried. In present day, history is in books, while story can be in books or in the culture known to all. Recently, McCarthy and the HUAC hearings were written out of Maryland high school history books. So for generations of students, Senator McCarthy was no longer history, no longer real, did not exist. Myth, story, and legend are carried in the collective consciousness of a culture and are harder to eradicate than the swipe of a pen. How many of us, when we're asked to think of the real George Washington, can't help but think about his fictitious cherry tree? So while Arthur may or may not warrant inclusion in our modern day history books, his legends and stories have made him real for millions of people over centuries. His stories have been popular for longer than any other figure in the Western world, with the possible exception of Jesus. The history of Arthur in the centuries before William was shaped by male clerics and scholars who were writing for an educated male audience, many of whom were celibate. The role of women in these stories would probably have had a very different face to them had they not been shaped and written down in an era and culture where women were the daughters of Eve, responsible for the downfall of man. Not only powerless, but evil. In earlier Celtic stories, women played a very different role. There are strong women, some of them warriors, like Boudica, or queens, like Maeve. Again, how does this tie to our King Arthur? The stories of Arthur have lived because they've been crafted and changed over the centuries to fit with the sensibilities of the envisioned audience in mind. In the movies we'll see over the coming Saturdays, a variety of Arthurs are envisioned by authors and directors for a particular audience. For example, in the film last Saturday, the audience was clearly children, and the Arthur created for them was all too human, young and frightened of responsibility. Myths and legends can also be appropriated for use in a different time. We saw an example of this in the previous century with the Nazi appropriation of the Aryan race idea to justify the extermination of Jews and Gypsies. The epitome of this process in the 6th and 7th century was the adoption of the legendary British war leader, King Arthur, as the national hero of the Anglo-Saxons. So, where does this leave us? Based on the written record, the oral history, and the archaeological record, it seems fairly certain during these 400 years before William the Conqueror that there were stories of a person named Arthur who, like the famous Dutch boy with his finger in the dike, was able to hold off the Saxons for some period of time, make a reputation for himself, and gives future storytellers and writers a myth to build on. Thank you. questions? Yes. All the way in the back.
Okay, there's a question back there.
Thank you. Is it fair to say that for the Anglo-Saxons that Arthur was a secular messiah?
I'm sorry?
Is it fair to say that for the Anglo-Saxons was Arthur a secular messiah as opposed to a spiritual one?
I'm sorry, I don't think I'm hearing you.
What part didn't you understand?
Is it fair to say for the Anglo-Saxons was Arthur
A secular messiah.
a secular messiah? Certainly not for the Anglo-Saxons, because he was fighting the Anglo-Saxons. He was attacking them. Possibly for the British, but at that point, the British were Christianized, so that having a warrior leader, it wasn't until we get to the Knights Templar that we have warriors embracing a Christian life.
Well, you had said he had achieved the status second only to Jesus as far as being worshipped in a way or admired.
My only reference to Jesus was the fact that his story has continued for as long a period of time as Arthur's has. It was just all the other stories that we have faded out of people's minds, out of people's interests. But we've been interested in Arthur, or some people have been interested in Arthur since the 6th century. And I realized that was after the time of Jesus, but he also continued to provoke interest in people.
Do we have other questions?
I just had trouble hearing you. So in between Tintagel and Glastonbury, the tower you showed, what was the name? It began with a C. After Tintagel. You have a picture of a tower where Arthur kind of had his middle years, I guess, but I couldn't get the word that you were calling it.
Spiritual.
I think that the question is, because I had the same question, and that is the 3 sites, Glastonbury, Cadbury Hill. What was the third one?
Yeah, I criticize you all for not speaking up, and my husband had to remind me to use the microphone. Tintagel was the birthplace of Arthur. Cadbury Hill was a refortified earlier hill fort that had been expanded to be able to be a launching point for Arthur and a huge band of men to go off and fight the Anglo-Saxons. And Glastonbury Abbey is reputedly the death place of Arthur, where his bones were found, dug up, put in the church, lost, turned to dust. I mean, bones don't last forever.
Do we have other questions? Well, I would just like to, did you have another one? No. I would just like to thank you, Nancy. I would just like to thank you, Nancy, for tracing the complicated and elusive clues that can be brought together in the creation of the Arthur story. It's very complicated, and I thought you did a very clear job of elucidating it and making it making it obvious to us. So thank you so much.
Well, just
Oh,
Uh,
yes. Could you talk about the time and the movie on Saturday?
Just to be absolutely fair, it doesn't get any less complicated as we move forward in time, although it is a little bit more certain. We see after the Norman invasion and the conquest of England an explosion of stories about Arthur. The French, the Germans, everybody wanted a piece of the action. They all wrote their stories based on the bits that were left of Arthurian myth, Breton legends, and then threw in their own particular brand of seasoning to the mix. The film for Saturday will be at 2 o'clock right here, and it will be Excalibur.
Is it Excalibur?
Yes. So please, the only film that is not going to be at 2 o'clock, and I almost hate to say this, is the last film. And that's going to be, I'm not even going to give you the time because that's just going to get confusing. So we're going to have Excalibur, and we have a preview. Yes, we do.
Recording in progress. Let me see if I can get the.
So in the films that are coming up, I've tried to pull a balance of people today who are trying to reconstruct what they think that time might have looked like, who are trying to provide an introduction like The Sword and the Stone for children. Also pulling on, well, and Camelot, the musical, is trying to reconstruct what that period might have looked like with no resemblance to reality at all, but it's beautiful. And Monty Python and the Holy Grail, of course, pokes fun at us who are looking at the film. So I think for those of you who can make it, it's an interesting combination of different takes on King Arthur and his court and his knights and his queen and his sword. There's a wonderful curse in one of the early stories where somebody asks Arthur for something and Arthur says, well, you can have anything you want, anything you can think of to ask for, except my sword, my shield, my horse, my dog, my cape, 5 or 6 other things. And you know what's the last thing in the list? My queen. You can have anything else. Thank you guys for coming.